Welcome. My name is Mark Raymond, and I'm with the program committee at Penn's Village. And we have a great program for everybody today. Another episode of Penn's Village Reads. And I see a lot of faces who have been here before, so welcome to everybody. For people that have never been here, if you go to pennsvillage.org, that's our website. We'll explain everything about us, but we're part of the Village Network. And there are over 200, almost 200.
I can't put it up.
Mark, you're on mute.
Now am I okay?
Yes.
Okay. I think Molly is just going through the process. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
By accident.
we're glad you're here, Molly. So we're part of the Village Network, and it's neighbors helping neighbors live independently in their own home. If you'd like to volunteer, please contact us over the website. If you're not a member, please consider joining, as we'd love to have you. So today's program is going to be a really great one. The logistics are as follows. After we do the introductions and get started, Molly will then mute everybody. And that way you don't have to worry if you need to take a phone call or the dog or cat comes in and wants something, you won't hear it. So that's why you're going to be muted. At the very end, we'll unmute everybody and we can have comments. So the first part of the program is going to be read by Jane Ely, our Executive Director of Penn's Village. And today is June 19th, which makes this the 155th anniversary of Juneteenth. So it's a celebration of the legal abolition of slavery in the United States. The second one will be by Bob Uris, for those of you that see him in the Phillies hat. He will do 2 readings of Casey at the Bat, and we're very lucky because he wrote a third himself, and that will bring us into the present. And then we have Dante Murphy back, who is going to read about the frogs of Calaveras County, the Jumping Frogs, which is a Mark Twain piece. So Jane, welcome to you and welcome to everybody, and we'll get started.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm happy to read on this really important day that the city has designated as a city holiday. Let's move forward. So this is a piece called Juneteenth Worldwide Celebration. Juneteenth is the oldest nationally celebrated commemoration of the ending of slavery in the United States. Dating back to 1865, it was on June 19th that the Union soldiers, led by Major General Gordon Granger, landed at Galveston, Texas, with news that the war had ended and that the enslaved were now free. Note that this was 2.5 years after President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which had become official January 1st, 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation had little impact on the Texans due to the minimal number of Union troops to enforce the new executive order. However, with the surrender of General Lee in April of 1865 and the arrival of General Granger's regiment, the forces were finally strong enough to influence and overcome the resistance. Later attempts to explain this 2.5-year delay in the receipt of this important news have yielded several versions that have been handed down through the years. Often told is the story of a messenger who was murdered on his way to Texas with the news of freedom. Another is that the news was deliberately withheld by the enslavers to maintain the labor force on the plantations. And still another is that federal troops actually waited for the slave owners to reap the benefits of one last cotton harvest before going to Texas to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. All of which, or neither of these versions, could be true. Certainly for some, President Lincoln's authority over the rebellious states was in question. For whatever the reasons, conditions in Texas remained status quo well beyond what was statutory. One of General Granger's first orders of business was to read to the people of Texas General Order Number 3, which began most significantly with, quote, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired laborer," unquote. The reactions to this profound news ranged from pure shock to immediate jubilation. While many lingered to learn of this new employer-to-employee relationship, many left before these offers were completely off the lips of their former masters, attesting to the varying conditions on the plantations and the realization of freedom. Even with nowhere to go, many felt that leaving the plantation would be their first grasp of freedom. North was a logical destination, and for many it represented true freedom, while the desire to reach family members in neighboring states drove some into Louisiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. Settling into these new areas as free men and women brought on new realities and the challenges of establishing a heretofore non-existent status for Black people in America. Recounting the memories of that great day in June of 1865 and its festivities would serve as motivation as well as a release from the growing pressures encountered in their new territory. The celebration of June 19th was coined Juneteenth and grew with more participation from descendants. The Juneteenth celebration was a time for reassuring each other, for praying, and for gathering remaining family members. Juneteenth continued to be highly revered in Texas decades later, with many former slaves and descendants making an annual pilgrimage back to Galveston on this date. A range of activities were provided to entertain the masses, many of which continue in tradition today. Rodeos, fishing, barbecuing, and baseball are just a few of the typical Juneteenth activities you may witness today. Juneteenth almost always focused on education and self-improvement. Thus, often guest speakers are brought in and the elders are called upon to recount the events of the past. Prayer services were also a major part of these celebrations. Certain foods became popular and subsequently synonymous with Juneteenth celebrations, such as strawberry soda pop. More traditional and just as popular was the barbecuing, through which Juneteenth participants could share in the spirit and aromas that their ancestors, the newly emancipated African Americans, would have experienced during their ceremonies. Hence, the barbecue pit is often established as a center of attention at Juneteenth celebrations. Food was abundant because everyone prepared a special dish. Meats such as lamb, pork, and beef, which were not available every day, were brought on this special occasion. True Juneteenth celebrations left visitors well satisfied and with enough conversation to last until the next. Dress was also an important element in early Juneteenth customs, and it is often still taken seriously, particularly by the direct descendants who can make the connection to this tradition's roots. During slavery, there were laws on the books in many areas that prohibited or limited the dressing of the enslaved. During the initial days of the emancipation celebrations, there are accounts of former slaves tossing their ragged garments into the creeks and rivers to adorn clothing taken from the plantations belonging to their former masters. In the early years, little interest existed outside the African American community in participation in the celebrations. In some cases, there was outwardly exhibited resistance by barring the use of public property for the festivities. Most of the festivities found themselves out in rural areas around rivers and creeks that could provide for additional activities such as fishing, horseback riding, and barbecues. Often the church grounds were the site for such activities. Eventually, as African Americans became landowners, land was donated and dedicated for these festivities. One of the earliest documented land purchases in the name of Juneteenth was organized by Reverend Jack Yates. This fundraising effort yielded $1,000 in the purchase of Emancipation Park in Houston, Texas. In Mexia, the local Juneteenth organization purchased Booker T. Washington Park, which had become the Juneteenth celebration site in 1898. There are accounts of Juneteenth activities being interrupted and halted by white landowners, demanding that their laborers return to work. However, it seems most allowed their workers the day off, and some even made donations of food and money. For decades, these annual celebrations flourished, growing continuously with each passing year. In Booker T. Washington Park, as many as 20,000 African Americans once flowed through during the course of a week, making the celebration one of the state's largest. Economic and cultural forces provided for a decline in Juneteenth activities and participants beginning in the early 1900s. Classroom and textbook education in lieu of traditional home and family taught practices stifled the interest of the youth due to less emphasis and detail on the activities of former slaves. Classroom textbooks proclaimed Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863 as a date signaling the end of slavery, and little or nothing on the impact of General Granger's arrival on June 19th. The Depression forced many people off the farms and into the cities to find work. In these urban environments, employers were less eager to grant leaves to celebrate this date. Thus, unless June 19th fell on a weekend or holiday, there were very few participants available. July 4th was the already established independence holiday, and a rise in patriotism steered more toward this celebration. The civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s yielded both positive and negative results for the Juneteenth celebrations. While it pulled many of the African American youth away and into the struggle for racial equality, many linked these struggles to the historical struggles of their ancestors. This was evidenced by student demonstrators involved in the Atlanta Civil Rights Campaign in the early 1960s who wore Juneteenth freedom buttons. Again, in 1968, Juneteenth received another strong resurgence through poor people's marches to Washington. Reverend Ralph Abernathy's call for people of all races, creeds, economic levels, and professions to come to Washington to show support for the poor. Many of these attendees returned home and initiated Juneteenth celebrations in areas previously absent of such activity. In fact, two of the largest Juneteenth celebrations founded after this march are now held in Milwaukee and Minneapolis. Interesting. On January 1st, 1980, Juneteenth became an official state holiday through the efforts of Al Edwards, an African-American state legislator. The successful passage of this bill marked Juneteenth as the first emancipation celebration granted official state recognition. Edwards has since actively sought to spread the observance of Juneteenth all across America. Today, Juneteenth is enjoying a phenomenal growth rate within communities and organizations throughout the country. Institutions such as the Smithsonian, the Henry Ford Museum, and others have begun sponsoring Juneteenth-centered activities. In recent years, a number of local and national Juneteenth organizations have arisen to take their place alongside other organizations, all with the mission to promote and cultivate knowledge and appreciation of African American history and culture. Juneteenth today celebrates African American freedom and achievement while encouraging continuous self-development and respect for all cultures. As it takes on a more national, symbolic, and even global perspective, the events of 1865 in Texas are not forgotten, for all of the roots tie back to this fertile soil from which a National Day of Pride is growing. The future of Juneteenth looks bright as the number of cities and states creating Juneteenth committees continues to increase. Respect and appreciation for all of our differences grow out of exposure and working together. Getting involved and supporting Juneteenth celebrations creates new bonds of friendship and understanding amongst us. This indeed brightens our future And that is the spirit of Juneteenth.
Thank you,
Hey.
Jane.
Very apropos today.
Yes, indeed. Thank
I
you.
think it's great that our city stepped up.
Am I up now?
Yep, Bob, I'm going to ask you if you would like, you could tell people a little bit about yourself, or you could go right into the reading, however you want to do it.
Okay. I'm Bob Uris. I'm a relatively new member of Penn's Village, and I'm a retired hospital administrator. I spent quite a few years at Children's Hospital before retiring, and I am wearing a baseball cap, Phillies cap and a Phillies shirt, but in fact, I'm not quite the enormous baseball fan that I probably look to be in this. Both of these are borrowed by people who are great fans. I'm going to read 3 poems, and the first one is the most famous baseball poem of all, and there probably have been hundreds of baseball poems written. If you look online, you can see a few of them. But the one I remember hearing as a boy over the radio before TV came along, and many times since then, is Casey at the Bat. And I will read that first, and then I'm going to read one that I found called 20 Years Later. By the way, Casey at the Bat was ran in 1888 in the San Francisco Examiner. 20 years later, in 1908, was the poem 20 Years Later, which gets back Casey as a middle-aged man. With everything that's going on now, I thought that I would take my hand at writing a Casey 132 years later, and that's going to be the poem I'm going to read at the end, if any of you are still awake to hear it by then. So here goes Casey at the Bat, a ballad of the Republic. The outlook wasn't brilliant for the Mudville 9 that day. The score stood 4-2 with but 1 inning left to play. And then when when Cooney died at first and Barrows did the same, a sickly silence fell upon the patrons of the game. A straggling few got up to go in deep despair. The rest clung to that hope which springs eternal in the human breast. They thought, if only Casey could but get a whack at that. We'd put up even money now with Casey at the bat. But Flynn preceded Casey, as did also Jimmy Blake, and the former was a Lulu and the latter was a cake. So upon that stricken multitude, grim melancholy sat, for there seemed but little chance of Casey getting to the bat. But Flynn let drive a single to the wonderment of all, and Blake, the much despised, tore the cover off the ball. And when the dust had lifted and men saw what had occurred, there was Jimmy safe at second and Flynn a hugging third. Then from 5,000 throats and more, there rose a lusty yell. It rumbled through the valley. It rattled in the dell. It knocked upon the mountain and recoiled upon the flat. For Casey, mighty Casey, was advancing to the bat. There was ease in Casey's manner as he stepped into his place. There was pride in Casey's bearing and a smile on Casey's face. And when, responding to the cheers, he lightly doffed his cap, no stranger in the crowd could doubt 'twas Casey at the bat. 10,000 eyes were on him as he rubbed his hands with dirt. 5,000 tongues applauded when he wiped them on his shirt. Then, while the writhing pitcher ground the ball into his hip, Defiance gleamed in Casey's eye. A sneer curled Casey's lip. And now the leather-covered sphere came hurtling through the air, and Casey stood a-watching it in haughty grandeur there. Close by the sturdy batsman, the ball unheeded sped. "That ain't my style," said Casey. "Strike one," the umpire said. From the benches, black with people, there went up a muffled roar, like the beating of the storm waves on a stern and distant shore. "Kill him! Kill the umpire!" shouted someone in the stand. And it's likely they'd have killed him had not Casey raised his hand. With a smile of Christian charity, great Casey's visage shone. He stilled the rising tumult. He bade the game go on. He signaled to the pitcher, and once more the spheroid flew. But Casey still ignored it, and the umpire said, "Strike two!" "Fraud!" cried the maddened thousands, and echo answered fraud. But one scornful look from Casey, and the audience was awed. They saw his face grow stern and cold. They saw his muscles strain, and they knew that Casey wouldn't let that ball go by again. The sneer is gone from Casey's lip. His teeth are clenched in hate. He pounds with cruel violence his bat upon the plate. And now the pitcher holds the ball, and now he lets it go. And now the air is shattered by the force of Casey's blow. Oh, somewhere in this favored land, the sun is shining bright. The band is playing somewhere, and somewhere hearts are light. And somewhere men are laughing, and somewhere children shout. But there is no joy in Mudville. Mighty Casey has struck out. That's the 1888 poem. Thank you. And now, 20 years later, a poem that many of us, I certainly did not know, that also was published back in a day when newspapers used to publish poems. I haven't seen one in the paper in my lifetime. So here's 20 years later. The Bugville team was surely up against a rocky game. The chances were they'd win defeat and not undying fame. 3 men were hurt and 10 were benched. The score was 6-4. They had to make 3 hard-earned runs in just 2 innings more. "It can't be done," the captain said, a pallor on his face. "I've got 2 pitchers in the field, a mutt on second base, and should another man get spiked or crippled in some way, the team would sure be down and out with 8 men left to play. We're up against it anyhow, as far as I can see. My boys ain't hitting like they should, and that's what worries me. The luck is with the other side. No pennant will we win. It's mighty tough, but we must take our medicine and grin." The 8th round opened. 1, 2, 3, the enemy went down. The Bugville boys went out the same. The captain wore a frown. The first half of the 9th came round. 2 men had been put out when Bugville's catcher broke a thumb and could not go the route. A deathly silence settled o'er the crowd assembled there. Defeat would be allotted them. They felt it in the air. With only 8 men in the field, 'twould be a gruesome fray. Small wonder that the captain cursed the day he learned to play. Lend me a man to finish with, he begged the other team. Lend you a man? The foe replied. My boy, you're in a dream. We came to win the pennant too. That's what we're doing here. There's only one thing you can do. Call for a volunteer. The captain stood and pondered in a listless sort of way. He never was a quitter, and he would not be today. Is there within the grandstand here, his voice rang loud and clear, a man who has the sporting blood to be a volunteer? Again, that awful silence settled o'er the multitude. Was there a man among them with such recklessness imbued? The captain stood with cap in hand, while hopeless was his glance. And then a tall and stocky man cried out, I'll take a chance. Into the field he bounded with a step both firm and light. Give me a mask and mitt, he said. Let me finish up the fight. The game is now beyond recall. I'll last at least a round. Although I'm ancient, you will find me muscular and sound. His hair was sprinkled here and there with little streaks of gray. Around his eyes and on his brow, a bunch of wrinkles lay. The captain smiled despairingly and slowly turned away. Why, he's all right, one rooter yelled. Another, let him play. All right, go on, the captain sighed. The stranger turned around, took off his coat and collar too, and threw them on the ground. The humor of the situation seemed to hit them all, and as he donned the mask and mitt, the umpire cried, play ball. 3 balls the pitcher at him heaved. 3 balls of lightning speed. The stranger caught them all with ease and did not seem to heed. Each ball had been pronounced a strike. The side had been put out, and as he walked in toward the bench, he heard the rooters shout. One bug-billed boy went out on strikes, and one was killed at first. The captain saw them fail to hit and gnashed his teeth and cursed. The third man smashed a double, and the fourth man swatted clear. Then a thunder of applause. Up came the volunteer. His feet were planted in the earth. He swung a warlike club. The captain saw his awkward pose and softly whispered, dub. The pitcher looked at him and grinned, then heaved a mighty ball. The echo of that fearful swat still lingers with us all. High, fast and far the spheroid flew. It sailed and sailed away. It ne'er was found, so it's supposed it still floats on today. 3 runs came in. The pennant would be Bugville's for a year. The fans and players gathered round to cheer the volunteer. What is your name? The captain asked. Tell us your name, cried all, as down his cheeks great tears of joy were seen to run and fall. For one brief moment he was still, then murmured, soft and low, I'm the mighty Casey who struck out just 20 years ago. I love that poem. And now for a humble offering from someone who's not the equal of the other 2 poets, but I'm trying my best to bring Casey at the bat up to date. Casey, 132 years later. The season was about to start, and we were really set. But nasty bugs produced concern, led scientists to fret. Coronavirus looms ahead, the gloomy experts said. If we don't act and act right now, a lot might soon be dead. Play ball, we said. Don't shelter us from fun and utmost glee. The Mudville Nine, the Phillies crew, they're all we have to see. But mighty Casey spoke to us and told us something new. A Mudville game would be a loss if we struck out with flu. And Mudville's captain also said, as sorrow filled his face, we can't get sick. We must step back to save the human race. And so our teams for now, and so our teams won't play for now. We so wish they could. And youthful Casey won't take bat and gain us fame. He should. The older Casey too won't come and take his wondrous swing to save the game and win the day, to lead us into spring. Instead, we'll talk on Zoom for now and wait until a cure will set us free and guarantee that we can know for sure that our dear Phils can soon return and fans can all be free to cheer the team, to root it on, if only on TV. That's it. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent.
Bob, thank you so much. That was just what I think we all needed to hear.
Okay, thanks again.
Loss, redemption, and hope. Did I kind of get it right there, the three things?
You got it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much.
I love the passion that that he read with.
I would
Thank
agree.
you. My wife told me when I practiced that I was reading way too fast and that I had to slow down, and I tried to do it. I may still have been a little fast at times, but I worked at it.
I'll tell you what, I'm the one who speaks worse English, and I understood everything perfect. So you did right.
It was wonderful. Thank you. And now Dante Murphy is up. You may remember Dante from his reading from Ernest Hemingway. And now he's going to give us some Mark Twain. So I think that's wonderful for the summer. The celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County. Dante, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself or the piece, or however you'd like to do it? Welcome.
Sure. I'll give a momentary bit about the piece. So this next author, he's no Bob Uris, but you may have heard of him. His name is Mark Twain. And this was one of his earliest published pieces. Ironically and coincidentally enough, because I had no idea we were going to be talking about Juneteenth when I first agreed to do this story, but this was actually published in the year of 1865, the year that Juneteenth happened. And it's an example of a parable. So it doesn't really, there's not much plot to it, but it's an example of how Twain began to hone his voice as a storyteller. And in it, there are a lot of phonetic spellings. So I'm going to read it exactly as written. So if I mispronounce some words or appear to be speaking in a bizarre accent, most of that will be on purpose, and that which is not on purpose, I'm not going to tell you. Mark Twain, the celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County. In compliance with the request of a friend of mine who wrote me from the East, I called on good-natured, garrulous old Simon Wheeler and inquired after my friend's friend, Leonidas W. Smiley, as requested to do, and I hereunto append the result. I have a lurking suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is a myth, that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that if I asked old Wheeler about him, it would remind him of the infamous Jim Smiley, and he would go to work and Sorry, where did I lose everybody? Can you all hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now, Dante. I don't know what happened there, but I think it was just a sentence or two, so you can just go back a couple.
Okay. I'll start here. I have a lurking suspicion that the Leonidas W. Smiley is a myth, that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that if I asked old Wheeler about him, it would remind him of his infamous Jim Smiley, and he would go to work and bore me to death with some exasperating reminiscence of him, as long and as tedious as it should be useless to me. If that was the design, he succeeded. I found Simon Wheeler dozing comfortably by the barroom stove of the dilapidated tavern in the decayed mining camp of Angels, and I noticed that he was fat and bald-headed and had an expression of winning gentleness and simplicity upon his tranquil countenance. He roused up and gave me good day. I told him that a friend of mine had commissioned me to make some inquiries about a cherished companion of his boyhood named Leonidas W. Smiley, Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, a young minister of the gospel who he had heard was at one time a resident of Angel's Camp. I added that if Mr. Wheeler could tell me anything about this Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, I would feel under many obligations to him. Simon Wheeler backed me into a corner and blockaded me there with his chair, and then sat down and reeled off the monotonous narrative which follows this paragraph. He never smiled, he never frowned, he never changed his voice from the gentle flowing key to which he tuned his initial sentence. He never betrayed the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm. But all through the interminable narrative there ran a vein of impressive earnestness and sincerity, which showed me plainly that, so far from his imagining that there was anything ridiculous or funny about the story, he regarded it as a really important matter and admired its two heroes as men of transcendent genius in finesse. I let him go on in his own way and never interrupted him once. Reverend Leonidas, well, there was a feller here once by the name of Jim Smiley in the winter of '49, or maybe it was the spring of '50, I don't recollect exactly somehow, though what makes me think it was the one or the other is because I remember the big flume wasn't finished when first come to camp. But anyway, he was the curiousest man about always betting on anything that turned up you ever see. If he could get anybody to bet on the other side, and if he couldn't, he'd change sides. Any way that suited him, the other man would suit him. Anyway, just so as he got a bet, he was satisfied. But still, he was lucky, uncommon lucky. He almost always come out winner. He was always ready and laying for a chance. There couldn't be no solitary thing mentioned, but that feller'd offer up to bet on it and take every side you please. As I was just telling you, if there was a horse race, you'd find him flush, or you'd find him busted at the end of it. If there was a dog fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a cat fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a chicken fight, he'd bet on it. Why, if there was two birds sitting on a fence, he would bet you which one would fly first. Or if there was a camp meeting, he would be the regular to bet on Parson Walker, which he judged to be the best exhorter about here, and so he was too, and a good man. If he ever seen a straddlebug start to go anywheres, he would bet you how long it would take him to get to wherever he was going to, and if you took him up, he would follow that straddlebug to Mexico, but what would find out where he was bound for and how long he was on the road. Lots of the boys here have seen that Smiley and can tell you about him. While it never made no difference to him, he'd bet on anything. The dangdest feller. Parson Walker's wife laid very sick once for a good while, and it seemed as if there weren't going to save her. But one morning he come in and Smiley up and asked him how she was, and he said she was considerable better, and thank the Lord for his infinite mercy, and coming on so smart that with the blessing of Providence you get well yet, And Smiley, before he thought, says, well, I'll risk 2.5 she don't anyway. This year Smiley had a mare. Boys called her the 15-minute nag, but that was only in fun, you know, because of course she was faster than that. And he used to win money on that horse, for all she was so slow and always had the asthma, or the distemper, or the consumption, or something of that kind. They used to give her 200 or 300 yards start, and then pass her underway. But always at the fag end of the race, she'd get excited and desperate like and come cavorting and straddling up and scattering her legs around limber, sometimes in the air, sometimes out to one side among the fences, and kicking up more dust and raising more racket with her coughing and sneezing and blowing her nose, and always fetch up at the stand just about a neck ahead, as near as you could cipher it down. And he had a little small bull pup that to look at him you'd think weren't worth a cent, but to sit around and look ornery and lay for a chance to steal something. But as soon as money was up on him, he was a very different dog. His underjaw began to stick out like a foxhole of a steamboat, and his teeth would uncover and shine like the furnaces. And a dog might tackle him and bully rag him and bite him and throw him over his shoulder 2 or 3 times. And Andrew Jackson, which was the name of the pup, Andrew Jackson would never let on but what he was satisfied and hadn't expected nothing else. And with the bets being doubled and doubled on the other side all the time till the money was all up, and then all of a sudden he would grab the other dog just by the jint of his hind leg and freeze to it. Not chaw, you understand, but only just grip and hang on till they throwed up the sponge, if it was a year. Smiley always come out a winner on that pup, till he harnessed a dog once that didn't have no hind legs because they'd been sawed off in a circular saw. And when the thing had gone along far enough and the money was all up and he come to make a snatch for his pet Holt, he said in a minute how he'd been imposed on, how the other dog had let him in the door, so to speak, and he appeared surprised. And then he looked sort of discouraged like, and he didn't try no more to win the fight, and so he got shucked out bad. He gives Smiley a look as much to say his heart was broke, and it was his fault for putting up a dog that had no hind legs for him to take hold of, which was his main dependence in the fight. And then he limped off a piece and laid down and died. It was a good pup, was that Andrew Jackson, and would have made a name for himself if he lived for the stuff that was in him. And he had a genius, I know it, because he had no opportunities to speak of, and it don't stand to reason that a dog could make such a fight as he could under them circumstances if he hadn't no talent. It always makes me feel sorry when I think of that last fight of his and the way it turned out. Well, this year Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and 2 tomcats and all them kind of things till you couldn't rest and you couldn't fetch nothing for him to bet on but he'd match you. He catched a frog one day and took him home and said he'd calculated to educate him. And so he never done nothing for 3 months but sat in his backyard and learn that frog to jump. And you bet you he did learn him to. He'd give him a little punch behind, and the next minute you'd see that frog whirling in the air like a donut. See him turn 1 somerset or maybe a couple if he got a good start, and come down flat-footed all right like a cat. He got him up so in a matter of catching flies and keeping pace with practice so consistent that he'd nail a fly every time as fur as he could see. Smiley said all the frog wanted was education, and he could do most anything, and I believe him. Why, I've seen him set Daniel Webster down there on this floor, Daniel Webster was the name of the frog, and sing out, "Flies, Daniel, flies," and quicker than you could come a wink, he'd spring straight up and snake a fly off from the counter there and flop down on the floor again as solid as a gob of mud, and fall to scratching the side of his head with his hind foot as indifferent as if he had no idea he'd been doing any more than any frog might do. You never seen a frog so modest and straightforward as he was, for all he was so gifted. And when it come to fair and square jumping on a dead level, he could get over more ground at one straddle than any animal of his breed you ever see. Jumping on a dead level was his strong suit, you understand, and it would come to that, Smiley would ante up money on him as long as he had a red. Smiley was monstrous proud of his frog, and well might he be, for fellers that had traveled and been everywhere all said he had laid over any frog that ever they see. Well, Smiley kept the beast in a little lattice box, and he used to fetch him downtown sometimes and lay for a bet. One day a feller, a stranger in the camp he was, come across him with his box and says, "What might it be you got in that box?" And Smiley says, sort of indifferent like, "It might be a parrot, or it might be a canary maybe, but it ain't. It's only just a frog." And the feller took it and looked at it careful and turned it round this way and that and says, "So 'tis. Well, what's he good for?" "Well," Smiley says, easy and careless, "he's good enough for one thing, I should judge. He can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." The feller took the box again and took another long, particular look and give it back to Smiley. And he says, very deliberate, "Well," he says, "I don't see no prints about that frog that's any better than any other frog." "Maybe you don't," Smiley says. "Maybe you understand frogs and maybe you don't understand them. Maybe you've had experience and maybe you ain't. Only an amateur, as it was. Anyways, I've got my opinion and I'll risk $40 that he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." And the feller studied a minute and then he says, kinder sad like, "Well, I'm only a stranger here and I ain't got no frog, but if I had a frog, I'd bet you." And then Smiley says, that's all right. If you'll hold my box a minute, I'll go and get you a frog." And so the feller took the box and put up his $40 along with Smiley's and sat down to wait. So he sat there a good while thinking to himself, and then he got the frog out and prized his mouth open and took a teaspoonful and filled him full of quail shot, filled him pretty near up to his chin, and set him on the floor. Smiley went to the swamp and slopped around in the mud for a long time, and finally he catched the frog and fetched him in and give him to this feller and says, "Now if you're ready, set him alongside of Daniel with his forepaws just even with Daniel's, and I'll give the word." Then he says, 1, 2, 3, get! And him and the feller touched up the frogs from behind, and the new frog hopped off lively, but Daniel give a heave and hoisted his shoulders up so like a Frenchman where it wasn't no use. He couldn't budge. He was planted as solid as a church, and he couldn't no more stir up than if he was anchored out. Smiley was a good deal surprised. He was disgusted too, but he didn't have no idea what the matter was, of course. The feller took the money and started away, and when he was going out the door, he sort of jerked his thumb over his shoulder, so at Daniel, and says again, very deliberately, "Well," he says, "I don't see no punts about that frog that's any better than any other frog." Smiley stood scratching his head and looking down at Daniel a long time, and at last he says, "I do wonder what in the nation that frog thrown off for. I wonder if there ain't something the matter with him. He appears to look mighty baggy somehow." And he catched Daniel up by the nape of his neck and hefted him and says, "Why, blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pounds, and turned him upside down, and he belched out a double handful of shot. And then he see how it was, and he was the maddest man. He set the frog down and took after that feller, but never catched him, and..." Here Simon Wheeler heard his name called from the front yard and got up to see what was wanted. And turning to me as he moved away, he said, "Just set where you are, stranger, and rest easy. I ain't going to be gone a second." But by your leave, I did not think that a continuation of the history of the enterprising vagabond Jim Smiley would likely to afford me much information concerning Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, so I started away. At the door, I met the sociable Wheeler returning, and he buttonholed me and recommenced. "Well, Smiley had a yaller one-eyed cow that didn't have no tail, only just a short stump like a banana, and..." However, lacking both time and inclination, I did not want to hear about the afflicted cow, but took my leave.
Well, Dante, that was that was really great. Thank you. And I think that the way you read it was a really nice thing to do. I felt like I was there. So maybe Molly could unmute everybody.
Yeah.
Take a little bit, take a while. And
I think most people are unmuted unless they've muted themselves, but I'll go
Okay.
through here.
So
Sometimes it takes a minute for Zoom to catch up with me.
okay. we're we're becoming pretty good at this, though. Thank you, Molly. So does anybody have anything they'd like to talk about?
Well, I have a frog story.
Okay, great.
My husband and I had a house down in the mountains in North Carolina. It was really, obviously, a very different life. We spent half a year there and half a year back here. So on July 4th one year, 2 of my grandchildren were visiting, and we went to the Spruce Pine July 4th celebration. And what do you think they had there? They had a frog jumping contest. And so my grandson, who was about 7, said, I want to do that. I want to do that. So we paid $1 and got him a little frog. And there were about 1,000 kids who were doing that. So he had to wait in line. So he went through the first round and his frog made it. So he went through the second round and his frog made it. Now it's about 3 hours. And we're wishing that this frog would have shot in him so he couldn't move. In any event, on the third round he lost, and it was a devastating loss for him. He has never forgotten it. But you know how they do it. They use a little feather and they tickle their behind, and that's how you get them to move.
Yeah, I didn't realize there was actually frog jumping contests.
Oh my goodness, yes. Oh, there were very interesting contests. I have one more story about the fair, if I may I?
Of course.
My granddaughter, who was then about, I don't know, 10 or 11 years old, they were at this stall where you throw a ball, and if you hit the target, the fireman or the policeman goes into a bucket of water. So the guy in front of us missed, and somebody made fun of him and said, you throw like a girl. So up goes my granddaughter, Allie, and that first ball was as straight onto the target as could be, but not quite strong enough. But the second one got it, and into the water went the fireman, and my granddaughter, you had to see her, with her hands on her hips, and said, I throw like a girl. And she now lives on her own sailboat in Charlestown Harbor and gets to deliver boats from Florida to St. Thomas and so forth. She is tough. Good girl.
Wow. Wow.
Anybody? That's a yeah. That's a great story, and so timely, though, isn't it?
Yes.
I thought that I would like to mention just a little detail. How, going back to the story, the frog story by Twain, how a great writer can take something so non-important like a frog and make an amazing story with that. I mean, the creativity is amazing.
I would have to agree.
Yes. Mundane.
Oh, yeah. I loved Jane's presentation and the stories. They were wonderful. I have 2 stories. They're not, you probably won't think they're funny, but they really impressed me. They happened back in the 1970s when I was a student starting out my dissertation research and living in Thailand. And I had a house up on stilts, as they used to have in Thailand. And in the rainy season, there were always frogs. During any season, there were always some kind of creepy crawlies in the house. I mean, we had lizards. Lizards lived in the house as well as mosquitoes and other things. And one time I went down to the bath, what was considered the bathroom was underneath the house, and it was one of those holes in the ground that you just squatted over. So I went down to use the bathroom, and there was a frog sitting in the water in that hole for the toilet. So that was a little disconcerting. I did not squat over it. I didn't dare because, frogs jump, as we well know now. The other thing was that the frogs in the rainy season would sing so loudly. I mean, it was the Messiah does not have the volume of the frogs just from outside around the house, croaking all night long in joy to have so much water around them. It was so much so that I actually tape recorded it and sent the recording home to say, do you believe these are frogs? So they have good voices, to say the least, as well as jumping legs.
It looks like Carol Raviola might have something she'd like to say.
Yeah, for those who are literarily interested, the Mark Twain story, well, when he was up in Calaveras County, he was at a place called Angel Camp, and you can actually go on Atlas Obscura and you can see the cabin he stayed in, which is really very rustic, very small. He was having a little bit of a trouble establishing himself with anything, so he began his career as a journalist, in a way thanks to Bret Hart and the Californian. He got paid, he's supposed to contribute an article a week, and he got paid $50 a month. And then, this is just sort of an interesting aside, he had to leave San Francisco I think it's a year after the Jumping Frog thing was published, because he wrote a big expose about the police, and that was not, people supported the police, so they basically ran him out of town for doing an expose on the police. And up in Calaveras, they still have jumping frog contests to this day, and the winner gets a plaque.
Wow, totally cool. So
I just want to make a comment that I thought, Bob, your creativity in creating the last poem was just fabulous. It just brought us to where we are now. Congratulations, it was just terrific.
Well, thank you so much.
we may have a poet laureate for Penn's Village.